Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. As we begin with Part 1 from the Bible, the story of a book by Manly P. Hall. The Bible, the story of a book by Manly P. Hall. Part 1, the Apostolic Age. This essay on the beginnings and unfoldment of the Christian tradition must begin with the Apostolic Age and extend to the Nicaean Council. It would be timely to call attention to Syrian Christianity. In 1818, Thomas Yeates, under the title Indian Church History, describes his volume as an account of the first planting of the gospel in Syria, Mesopotamia, and India, with an accurate relation of the first Christian missions in China. The work was long out of print when it came to the attention of Elizabeth A. Gordon, who caused it to be reprinted with remarkable notes and commentaries by herself under the title Asian Cristology and the Mahayana in 1921. This book is also extremely scarce. Jesus had authorized his apostles to disseminate his doctrines throughout the world. The labor was first entrusted to the Christian converts in the middle years of the first century. Yeates points out that the evangelizing resources in those days were greater than has generally been suspected. There were the 12 apostles invested with supreme power pertaining to the government of the church. Next in order were the 72 disciples corresponding in number and dignity with the elders of Israel. The third order was the 500 witnesses who beheld the ascension of the Lord. These are referred to as apostles, elders, and brethren, and they wrote letters by them after this matter. The apostles and elders and brethren send greeting unto the brethren which are of the Gentiles in Antioch and Syria and Cilicia. Acts 15:23. A considerable summary of the labors of these three groups is set forth in the Acts of the Apostles. From the accounts in the four Gospels, it is obvious that Jesus had a large following and a considerable sphere of influence. After his resurrection and the miracle of the Pentecost, his followers increased in number and carried the glad tidings to the nations of the East. Go ye therefore and teach all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you. And lo, I am with you always, even unto the end of the world. Amen. Matthew 28:19 and 20. This was according to the prophecy of Isaiah, for I know their works and their thoughts. It shall come that I will gather all nations and tongues, and they shall come and see my glory. And I will set a sign among them, and I will send those that escape of them unto the nations, to Tarshish, Pul, and Lud, that draw the bow, to Tubal, and Javan, to the isles afar off, that have not heard my fame, neither have seen my glory. And they shall declare my glory among the Gentiles. Isaiah 66:18 and 19. The apostles did not travel alone, but were accompanied by 2 or more of the disciples. After these things, the Lord appointed other 70 also, and sent them 2 and 2 before his face into every city and place whither he himself would come. Luke 10:1. These teachers were themselves from different countries and could speak a number of the Eastern languages and dialects. Then departed Barnabas to Tarsus, for to seek Saul, and when he had found him Paul, he brought him unto Antioch. And it came to pass that a whole year they assembled themselves with the church and taught much people. And the disciples were called Christians first Antioch. Acts 11:25 and 26. In the beginning the apostles remained in Jerusalem for some time, but under persecution were forced to depart from the holy city. There is no longer any doubt that the apostle Thomas reached India, established a church there, and was martyred by fanatics. St. Thomas, often referred to as Doubting Thomas, because he insisted on placing his hand on the wound in the side of Jesus after the resurrection, is said to have had vision to build a palace for the great king of the Indies. He preached in Persia, Ethiopia, and India. Marco Polo, writing in the 13th century, says that the body of the Apostle Thomas was entombed in Malabar, and that the tomb was frequently visited by both Christians and Muslims, and that earth taken from this site is believed to have miraculous powers. Christian communities with duly consecrated bishops were scattered throughout the Near, Central, and Far East. And there accompanied him Paul into Asia Sopater of Berea, and of the Thessalonians Aristarchus and Secundus, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timotheus, and of Asia, Tychicus and Trophimus, Acts 24. It is also known that these missionaries carried with them sacred writings, including versions of the scriptures and church ordinances. It is possible that the account of the life of Jesus found by Nicholas Notovich in the Hymis convent near the foot of Mount Everest is a genuine relic of Syrian Christianity. See the unknown life of Jesus Christ. It was established by Eusebius that the bishops who assembled at Nicaea brought with them sacred writings treasured in their churches and convents. There also seems to be proof that in some of the Buddhist communities, the Syrian monks were accepted as Buddhist bonzes, preaching a form of the Mahayana school of Buddhist philosophy. This may certainly account for a number of symbols and teachings common to both religions. It is interesting to note that John, Bishop of Persia and Great India, was one of the 318 delegates who framed and signed the Nicene Creed at the Council of Nicaea, 325 AD. This brings into focus a generally neglected history of Christianity during the nearly 3 centuries between the crucifixion of Christ and the Nicaean Council. There are reasonably accurate accounts of Greek and Latin church histories, but there has been a tendency to focus attention on the Western migrations of the faith. Until the so-called conversion of Constantine, the Roman Empire persecuted Christian converts, and the apostles Peter and Paul were martyred in Rome. It should be noted, however, that Joseph of Arimathea established a Christian community at Glastonbury, England in the 1st century. The patriarchs of Alexandria, together with other parts of Egypt and Ethiopia, trace their descent from the apostle Mark, who established a church in Alexandria, was martyred there, and his remains were later carried to Italy and placed in the Cathedral of St. Mark in Venice. Mosaics of St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice and scriptures on the walls caused the whole edifice, according to Mr. John Ruskin, to be called the Book of Common Prayer. Pantaenus, the venerable teacher and predecessor of Clement of Alexandria in the catechetical school of that city, was sent to India circa 189 AD and found there a copy of St. Matthew's Gospel, which he took to Egypt. And according to Eusebius, it was still extant in St. Jerome's day. See Asian Cristology and the Mahayana. John Kesson of the British Museum, in his book The Cross and the Dragon, London, 1854, states that the Chaldean or Syrian Christians spread so rapidly that they carried Christianity into the heart of Asia. Nestorius, who flourished in the 5th century AD, was an early victim of the political machinery of the Western Church. The Nestorians sought refuge in the Far East, and the great Nestorian stone setting forth the life of Christ probably dates from about 780 AD and summarizes the gospel account in Chinese characters and additional writings in Syrian. After the period of the Nestorian ministry, we hear very little in the Far East until Matteo Ricci, who reached China in 1583 AD. He converted the prime minister and his daughter, who versified the gospel and sent blind men all over China to sing. The Apostle Thomas, from an engraving by Albrecht Dürer, dated 1514. The apostle holds in his right hand the spear which was the instrument of his martyrdom, and in the left hand a book, presumably the Bible. The Nicaean Council. Constantine Magnus was neither the best nor the worst of the Roman emperors, but he was probably the most practical. He and Licinius issues the Edict of Milan, 313 AD, proclaiming the right of the Christians to follow the mode of religion which appeared best to them. After his victory over Licinius in 325, Constantine became the undisputed ruler over the far-flung Roman Empire. At this time, he stated that he looked forward to years of peace and security. Regardless of the motives imputed to him by others, the emperor acted with dignity, courtesy, and restraint in the delicate task of attempting to arbitrate the theological differences which had arisen among the Christian groups. As early as 318 AD, the imperial peace was disturbed by a bitter feud that arose between Alexander, Bishop of Alexandria, and Arius, one of the presbyters under his jurisdiction. Hard words passed between Alexander and Arius after the latter had refused to sign a statement that Christ was of the same divine nature as God. Arius was an outstanding intellectual and apparently liked to argue for the pleasure of controversy. He was a popular man in his community, in the course of time disrupted the Christian groups in Alexandria and became leader of a considerable following. The unhappy disturbance soon spread throughout the Christian church, which at that time had no unified leadership. Constantine, having inherited this dilemma with the purple, assumed the unpopular role of arbitrator or peacemaker. He was certainly justified in intervening as absolute ruler of the Roman Empire before the situation reached political importance. In this emergency, he dispatched his ecclesiastical advisor, the Bishop of Cordova, to Alexander and Arius, stating in substance that the squabble was of no importance and that the silly procedures were suitable only to children and not to priests or reasonable men. He added also that he hoped the matter could be settled so that he could continue to have quiet days and nights and enjoy the pure joys of life. It has been well observed that Constantine wrote as a tolerant and liberal-minded statesman, but he certainly was not properly informed on delicate matters of theology. He made light of an issue which to those involved was no trivial matter. Obviously, dignitaries of the church resented being accused of silly actions and likened to unruly children, especially by a pagan. It was evident that to Constantine, Christianity was still only one of the imperial burdens. He could only hope that the weight of his temporal authority could be used in some way to neutralize the friction. Nothing remained to be done but to call a general council of the entire Christian church. This Constantine resolved to do, possibly at the recommendation of Hosius, the Bishop of Cordova, who had failed in his mission of reconciliation. The council was therefore scheduled to meet at Nicaea Iznik in northwest Turkey the following spring, and Constantine expressed his decision to preside personally over the assembly. He pointed out that the clergy was in charge of the internal affairs of the church, but that he as emperor had been appointed by God to be bishop over the larger world with its temporal responsibilities. The General Council of Nicaea assembled in May 325 AD. More than 300 bishops, accompanied by their priests and deacons, attended the meetings. The Eastern Church was more strongly represented than the Western group, as the Bishop of Rome did not attend, but sent 2 legates. It was a strange and incongruous group that finally assembled in the Great Hall of the Imperial Palace. After all the bishops had duly assembled, the emperor himself made a spectacular entrance. He was robed in gold and purple and richly adorned with jewelry and precious stones. A chair of gold had been made for his convenience, and he presided with full imperial grandeur. He apparently considered it advisable to impress the entire assembly with the importance of the occasion. It has been reported that Constantine blushed when he entered the Great Hall and appeared ill at ease. There are several possible explanations for his lack of poise. He was still a pagan, presiding over a Christian council for the purpose of preventing, if possible, a religious war. The notion that he was overcome by religious humility in the presence of so august an assembly is most unlikely. If Constantine was sincerely interested in the future of Christianity, his embarrassment could be explained by the fact that he carried in his hands a collection of documents consisting of accusations and cross-accusations that had been privately forwarded to him by the various bishops, accusing each other of a variety of derelictions. As a pagan, Constantine made an opening address in which he emphasized the importance of Christian fellowship among the leaders of their churches, and reminded all that were assembled there and were true followers of Christ that they should forgive one another, serve God, and act with charity and love. Early engraving, source unknown, representing the Emperor Constantine embracing Christian bishops. Constantine's presence at the council has been subject to considerable criticism. Some hold that he should never have convoked an ecumenical assembly of this kind, and that in so doing he violated the spiritual prerogatives of the Church. Actually, however, he seems to have presided in an honorary capacity and took little part, if any, in the theological discussions. The real heads of the council on a religious level were probably Hosius of Cordova and the papal legates, Victor and Vicentius. Nor is it clear whether Constantine was acting under pressure of the Pope, Sylvester I. In any event, Constantine involved himself in an unhappy situation, scarcely inclined to excite his admiration. He listened from his golden throne to a series of bitter personal quarrels and recrimination. Arius arose and expressed his own opinions so vehemently that many of the bishops put their hands over their ears in horror. It was finally resolved to examine the scriptures with regard to the controversial points. Two men of the same name more or less dominated the proceedings. One was Eusebius of Nicomedia, a Greek bishop inclined to favor the opinions of Arius. The other was Eusebius of Caesarea, the ecclesiastical historian. At the Council of Nicaea, he led the moderates who, as their name indicated, represented a middle party and submitted the first draft of the Old Nicene Creed, which was adopted with certain important changes. Eusebius of Caesarea was close to Constantine, but critics of the council doubt his basic integrity. To say the least, he was determined to retain the friendship of Constantine. The emperor, realizing that the council was hopelessly entangled in its controversial issues, recommended the formulation of the basic creed to which all the various bishops would subscribe and thus have a common and mutually acceptable statement of orthodoxy. Eusebius of Caesarea offered the baptismal creed of his own church as a pattern, and, after certain phrases had been inserted, the creed was read to the council and signed by the majority of those present. 20 canons are attributed to the Nicaean Council. Most of these apply primarily to the clergy. Canon 17 forbade clerics to lend money at interest. The weighty matters having progressed as far as possible, Constantine took the occasion to celebrate the 20th anniversary of his accession and invited the bishops to a splendid banquet, at the end of which he bestowed rich presents upon them. Constantine had placed all facilities of transportation and communication at the disposal of the delegates, and it is noted that the banquet was the one occasion where there were no absentees. The records of the Nicaean Council are regrettably incomplete. Of this, Mosheim writes, "The council assembled by Constantine at Nice is one of the most famous and interesting events that are presented to us in ecclesiastical history. And yet, what is most surprising, scarcely any part of the history of the Church has been unfolded with such negligence, or rather passed over with such rapidity." He adds that no authentic acts of its famous sessions are now extant. Specific details are lacking concerning the selection of the various books which were brought together to form the New Testament. According to one account, the matter was solved by miraculous intervention. There seems to be very little to indicate that the canon or the controversy concerning the authority of the various books of the New Testament was actually solved at the Nicaean Council. There is one report on this by Pappus, but in all fairness it must be noted that supporting testimony is lacking. However, a more prosaic version implies that they were chosen by ballot. In 315 AD, Eusebius of Caesarea, in his ecclesiastical history, gives a catalogue of the New Testament books. His list is approximately the same as that accepted in modern times. Cyril, Bishop of Jerusalem, accepted the same classification with the exception of omitting the Book of Revelation. In 367 AD, Athanasius published his list. In all probability, the accepted list was approved with some reservations as early as Origen, 210 AD. The bishops who assembled at Nicaea brought most of their treasured scriptural writings with them. The fate of the rejected works is unknown. It is believed that Eusebius pointed out to Constantine the dilapidated condition of the treasured scrolls and parchments. In any event, the emperor saw the wisdom of providing the various congregations with a comprehensive text of the accepted writings. He therefore sponsored the preparation of 50 large and fine volumes to be prepared for the use of the principal churches in Constantinople. This is probably the first occasion in which the two testaments were united in one volume. The text was in Greek, and there is a strong probability that the Codex Sinaiticus and the Codex Vaticanus were produced at this time. The great codices of the Bible. The New Testament in the surviving form is known only through early Greek manuscripts, of which the earliest are believed to date from the 4th century AD. Three important manuscripts were probably among those commissioned by Constantine. They are the Codex Vaticanus, Codex B, Codex Alexandrinus, Codex A, and the Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Aleph. The first of these is in the Vatican Library, and the other two are in the British Museum. These manuscripts are called uncials because they are written entirely in capital letters. There is a strong possibility that the three codices mentioned above were written in Alexandria in Egypt. At that time, the Jewish and Christian communities shared a common interest in spiritual matters. Considering many other examples of their preoccupation with Gnosticism, Neoplatonism, and Kabbalism, Such a marriage of right minds would have been most appropriate. Furthermore, Alexandria was an important center of classical publishing. Organized groups of scribes would copy almost any manuscript available in the Alexandrian libraries for a reasonable fee. The final destruction of these libraries may well have destroyed precious biblical manuscripts. This concept of their Egyptian origin gained some support from the Mount Sinai manuscript of the Bible. One of the arguments used in favor of the theory that the manuscript was written in Egypt is the sporadic occurrence in it, both in the text itself and in the earlier corrections, of an omega of a very curious shape, as against the usual. This very rare form is found in one or two papyri from Egypt, notably in Papyrus 28 of the John Rylands Library, Mancanus. It appears to be unknown elsewhere. The Greek omega resembles a number 3 lying on its back. The unusual form referred to in the above quotation has the central stem extended upward to resemble a trident. There is a collection of sayings attributed to Jesus not included in the Gospels. These fragments are usually described as the logia, or words recorded or remembered by those who heard the Master speak. It has been customary to assume that they were derived from manuscripts of the Gospels, which have not survived to modern time. Possibly the earliest reference to these sayings is found in the 2nd century writings of Bishop Papias of Hierapolis, and further sayings appear in other writings of early church theologians as late as the 4th century. In our library, we have a small book published by the Oxford University Press under the title New Sayings of Jesus and Fragment of a Lost Gospel by Bernard P. Grenfell, Doctor of Literature, M.A., and Arthur S. Hunt, Doctor of Literature, M.A., London, 1904. These authors carried on excavations on the site of Oxyrhynchus, an ancient city about 120 miles south of Cairo. In 1897, they discovered the Oxyrhynchus papyri, of which Logion 5 is the one familiar to most biblical scholars. Jesus saith, "Wherever there are two, they are not without God, and wherever there is one alone, I say, I am with him. Raise the stone, and there thou shalt find me. Cleave the wood, and there am I." As usual, the discovery led to an intense scholarly controversy. Some authorities went so far as to suggest that the quotations may have originated among the Gnostic sects, which were deeply involved in esoteric Christianity. In the Chernoboscian library discovered near Nag Hammadi in the 1940s, there are many references to and quotations of Jesus, especially in the Pistis Sophia. At this point, it is appropriate to introduce Dr. Lobergott Friedrich Constantine von Tischendorf, who gained a worldwide reputation for his association with ancient biblical manuscripts. As a critic of the scriptural writings, he reflected a quality of literary integrity unsurpassed in his chosen field. The good doctor was born in 1815, received a typical scholastic education, including the University of Leipzig, and determined to make New Testament criticism the work of his life. We are not inclined to think of such a career as especially arduous, but Tischendorf died at the age of 59 from fatigue and overwork, after being ennobled by the Tsar of Russia for his achievements. Dr. Tischendorf found his path of higher criticism extremely difficult. To quote his own words, "I resolved in 1839 to devote myself to the textual study of the New Testament and attempted by making use of all the acquisitions of the last 3 centuries to reconstruct, if possible, the exact text as it came from the pen of sacred writers. For the accomplishment of this protracted and difficult enterprise, it was needful not only to undertake distant journeys, to devote much time, and to bring to the task both ability and zeal, but also to provide a large sum of money, and this, the sinews of war, was altogether wanting." The 2 oldest manuscripts available to Tischendorf were the Codex Vaticanus and the Codex Alexandrinus. The first had originally been a complete Bible, but both manuscripts were defective. Undaunted by poverty, which has been so aptly termed the disease of the learned, young Tischendorf started out without sufficient funds to buy himself a new suit of clothes. In the period from 1840 to 1843, he was in Paris, immersed in the treasures of the Bibliothèque Nationale. He made a scanty living assisting more famous scholars and publishing versions of the Greek New Testament. After numerous vicissitudes, he attempted his first journey to the Near East, Convinced that the old monastery and convent libraries of the Greek Orthodox Church contained manuscripts useful, if not absolutely necessary, in the reconstruction of scriptural writings. It was in the Holy Land that Dr. Tischendorf made his first great discovery. He tells us, "It was at the foot of Mount Sinai in the convent of St. Catherine that I discovered the pearl of all my researches. In visiting the library of the monastery in the month of May 1844, I perceived in the middle of the great hall a large and wide basket full of old parchments, and the librarian, who was a man of information, told me that 2 heaps of papers like these, molded by time, had been already committed to the flames. What was my surprise to find amid this heap of papers a considerable number of sheets of a copy of the Old Testament in Greek, which seemed to me to be one of the most ancient that I had ever seen. The authorities of the convent allowed me to possess myself of a third of these parchments, or about 43 sheets, all the more readily as they were destined for the fire. But I could not get them to yield up the possession of the remainder. The too lively satisfaction which I had displayed had aroused their suspicions as to the value of this manuscript. Tischendorf returned to Europe, and in 1846 published these fragments which he called the Codex Friderico Augustanus, in honor of the King of Saxony. The publication caused considerable stir among the scholastic elect, and he was appointed Professor Extraordinarius in Leipzig. He was certain in his own mind that a considerable part of the manuscript reposed in the convent of St. Catherine, for he had seen at least 86 more leaves. Realizing that the convent was in the Russian zone of influence, he sought and secured the assistance of Tsar Alexander II. In January 1859, Tischendorf was on his way back to the monastery. It appeared, however, that his mission would be unsuccessful. When it seemed that his trip had been in vain, he told his Bedouins on the 4th of February to hold themselves in readiness to leave on the 7th for Cairo. Towards evening, he accepted an invitation from the steward of the convent to take refreshments with him in his cell. He then took down from the corner of the room a bulky volume wrapped in a red cloth. To his amazement, Tischendorf saw the fragments which 15 years before he had seen in the basket, also other parts of the Old Testament and the New Testament complete. Eventually, in October 1859, after many adventures and delays, Tischendorf was able to secure the surviving leaves of the Mount Sinai Bible, and on the 19th of November he brought it to Russia and placed it in the hands of Tsar Alexander II. This monarch was so amazed and delighted that immediate steps were taken to publish an exact facsimile for the use of scholars throughout the world. The production was under the personal supervision of Dr. Tischendorf. The monastery of St. Catherine on Mount Sinai, reproduced from a picture by A. Dosatz, exhibited in Paris in 1845, from a handbook issued for the trustees of the British Museum in 1934. Leaf of the Codex Sinaiticus, showing the conclusion of the Book of Luke, 4th century AD, original in the British Museum. In 1869, the Codex was presented to the Emperor of all the Russias by the Archbishop and his monks. Tsar Alexander made a present of 9,000 rubles to the monastery in acknowledgement for the gift of the Codex. In a brochure published by the trustees of the British Museum in 1934, under the title The Mount Sinai Manuscript of the Bible, it is stated that the Codex Sinaiticus was purchased from the Soviet government in 1933 for the sum of £100,000. The British Museum brochure also notes that the purchase of the Codex would be of mutual advantage, as the Russian government would expend the purchase price on goods made in Great Britain, thus furnishing employment for workmen in the British Isles. I was in London when the manuscript was first placed on exhibition. It was accompanied by a contribution box inviting the public to participate in the acquisition of this priceless treasure. I gave modest support to this project. The 39 books of the Old Testament, as presented in the Christian Bible, were written over a period of several hundred years. Ben Sira's grandson in 132 BC refers to sacred writings of his people as the Law and the Prophets and other books of our fathers. The Torah of law is attributed to Moses and includes the 5 parts of the Holy Scripture from Genesis to Deuteronomy in the present order. The prophetic books are divided into the early, the later prophets, and the minor prophets, and total 21 books. Of the most famous are Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Jeremiah. The other books of our fathers number 13 and are among the most frequently read of the Old Testament writings. The Psalms and Proverbs are treasured by Jewish and Christian readers alike. Ecclesiastes is deeply devotional, and the Song of Songs attributed to Solomon was regarded by the alchemists as an allegory of the transmutation of metals. The Old Testament is indispensable to the complete canon because it provides theological, cosmological, and anthropological support to moral and ethical teachings presented in the New Testament. Post-Nicene Bibles. The Septuagint version of the Old Testament is the one quoted by Jesus in Luke 4:18 and 19. When Alexander the Great died, one of his leading officers named Lagos became Ptolemy I of Egypt, usually referred to as Ptolemy Soter, thus establishing the Macedonian dynasty in Egypt. Ptolemy offered the Palestinian Jews a permanent and secure home in Alexandria and granted them Macedonian citizenship, thus fusing Jewish, Greek, and Egyptian cultures, to which later was added the learning of the Latin world. The circumstances surrounding the production of the Septuagint version of the Old Testament is stated briefly in C.A. Muses' revised edition of the Septuagint Bible, 1954. Charles Thompson, 1729 to 1824, was the first to translate the Septuagint Bible into English. Thompson was secretary of the Continental Congress of the United States of America, a close friend of Thomas Jefferson, and was highly respected by most of the founding fathers. Dr. Muses tells us that during the reign of Ptolemy II, or Philadelphus, 285 BC, this pharaoh was actively engaged in the enrichment of the famous Alexandrian libraries, a large part of which was housed in the royal palace. It was pointed out to Ptolemy that his collection should include a Greek translation of the sacred books of the Jews. According to this account, Demetrius Phalereus, librarian of Ptolemy, recommended that the books of Moses be included in the great Alexandrian collection. Pharaoh was pleased at the idea and sent Aristeas and Andreas to Jerusalem to consult with Eleazar, who was then high priest. After being convinced of the sincerity of Ptolemy, Eleazar selected 72 men who had the greatest reputation for learning, 6 from each of the 12 tribes, and sent them to Alexandria. It is noted that the Jewish scholars completed the translation of the Pentateuch in 72 days. The translation was then read in the presence of Ptolemy and numerous learned Egyptians. The original translation was limited to the 5 books of Moses, but by the 1st century AD, this version included the complete Old Testament. The Septuagint translation was into Greek, which was more suitable to the scholarly atmosphere of the Alexandrian Jewish community. St. Jerome, 340 to 420, was ordained a priest at Antioch and went to Constantinople, where he developed a strong friendship for St. Gregory Nazianzus. In 385 AD, he left Rome for the last time and reached Bethlehem the following year, where he remained in a monastic institution, practicing extreme austerities and translating sacred texts. He wrote about 100 homilies addressed principally to members of the clergy. In religious art, he is often depicted accompanied by a lion and a cardinal's hat, which he never actually received due to the antagonism of prominent clerics. Leaf of the Septuagint version in parallel Greek and English, edition undated. The greater part of his life in Bethlehem was spent in translating the Testaments from Hebrew, Greek, and Latin manuscripts. Jerome completed the Vulgate in 405 AD. The term Vulgate means the common tongue, Vulgata in Latin. Pope Damasus, who was then Bishop of Rome, encouraged him to prepare the Latin version. During the period of translation, Jerome sent to Damasus his translation of the New Testament, accompanied by a letter which included the following statement: "But if we are compelled to seek the truth among many manuscripts, why not go back to the original Greek and with that before us, correct what has been faultily translated or recklessly amended by incompetent revisers, or added to or altered by nodding copyists?" See page 119 of the One Book, by Warwick James Price, Philadelphia, 1928. As might be expected, Jerome's labors were downgraded by most of his contemporaries, and it was not until the pontificate of Gregory the Great that the Vulgate was officially recognized in 604 AD. By the 6th century, manuscripts in several languages, including copies in Syrian, were in circulation. However, they added very little on the level of source material. After the destruction of the Temple at Jerusalem in 70 AD, the Septuagint version lost favor among Jewish scholars and rabbis, and an effort was made to prepare a new version with a special consideration of the doctrines of the Pharisees. This resulted in the Old Testament being revised by Aquila, and this revision was used in synagogues for a considerable length of time. This was a most significant period in the early history of the Bible, and reverence for the letter of the Scriptures increased rapidly and affected all subsequent editions. It became virtually impossible to correct errors and inconsistencies, and tradition seriously crippled scholarship. This attitude is strongly noticeable in connection with revisions during the last 50 years. Leaf of a 17th century manuscript of the Vulgate from the original in the Cathedral of Notre Dame at Paris from Universal Paleography by M.J.B. Sylvester, London, 1850. Title leaf of a pauper's Bible, undated but early 15th century. In the center is the Annunciation scene from H. Humphreys, History of the Art of Printing, London, 1868. From the 10th century to the invention of printing, the number of Bible manuscripts increased rapidly. But they were principally copies for use in monasteries, churches, and for noble families. Although intended to be faithful reproductions of earlier works, minor changes were made, partly due to the limited abilities of the scribes and partly to earlier inconsistencies, faithfully preserved or interpreted. For example, a scribe checking his work might find he had left out a word, so he placed it in the margin. A later copyist carefully repeated the procedure or attempted to discover a secret motive behind the previous error. Many old manuscripts developed marginalia, and it became impossible to determine the source of these annotations. Sometimes they were omitted as irrelevant, but not infrequently efforts were made to insert them as parts of the original texts. This is one reason why the great codices of the 4th and 5th centuries are so valuable to editors of the Bible. Printed editions of the Bible. The Venetians traded with China as early as the 13th century AD and probably adapted the Oriental woodblock printing technique in the production of playing cards. The Chinese, Korean, and Japanese already had extensive libraries of printed books several centuries earlier. Religious pictures printed from hand-cut wooden blocks using Oriental methods were circulated on the European continent 25 or 30 years before Gutenberg invented his press. Again, following the Asiatic precedent, groups of the separate block-printed leaves were brought together to form what is now called the Biblia Pauperum, or the Pauper's Bible. The collections consisted principally of biblical stories and were assembled in groups of 40 leaves. The accompanying illustration is reproduced from Humphreys' History of the Art of Printing, London, 1868. This leaf forms the title page of the first edition of the Biblia Pauperum. According to Humphreys, the overall theme features God the Father breathing upon the Virgin, and in the breath of deity, the Spirit of the Holy Ghost is seen descending in the form of a dove, followed by the infant Christ bearing his cross. Eve's temptation foreshadows the birth of Christ, and the armored figure of Gideon, who became saturated with dew, was made to typify Christ's birth by the infusion of the Holy Spirit. The facsimile is from the copy which came to the British Museum with the Royal Library. A leaf from the Psalter of 1456 by Gutenberg, from a reproduction panel printed in 1933 at the Chicago World's Fair. The Gutenberg Bible. The earliest book printed from movable type in Europe is now referred to as the Gutenberg Bible. It first appeared about the year 1455, but work upon it probably started in 1450. The motives behind this massive undertaking are not fully known or strictly honorable. The original intent might have been to sell the volumes as handwritten manuscripts similar to those in the libraries of the nobility and the clergy. A special font of type cast in metal from molds was prepared. In this font there were several widths of each letter, and it required much time and great pains to justify both margins and at the same time keep the spaces between letters and words uniform. A replica of the Gutenberg press was brought to Chicago for the World's Fair of 1933. Using the same techniques and copies of the original type, a number of sheets were struck off, one of which is reproduced here. This Psalter was printed in 1456, after Gutenberg lost control of his press. The motive which impelled Gutenberg to carry on his work in absolute secrecy has been the subject of considerable speculation. In any event, it brought him nothing but financial disaster. There's an old story that ecclesiastical authorities suspected that the devil was cooperating in the enterprise. It was obvious that actual manuscripts could not be produced with such speed and accuracy by any normal means. His creditors moved in on him and took possession of the printing equipment he had invented. The storm that surrounded the publication of the first printed Bible finally subsided. Adolf of Nassau, who became Bishop of Mainz in 1462, appointed Gutenberg a gentleman of his court, an elevation supported by an official diploma. Of this incident, Henry Noel Humphreys writes, "From the diploma dated 1465, which confers this honorary title upon Gutenberg, and which has been published by Johannes and also by Wolf, it appears not to have been entirely an empty honor that was thus bestowed, for we find included the annual grant of 20 matters of corn and barrels of wine for the use of his house, and also an official court suit, which, from what we know of the costume of the time, must have been of somewhat gorgeous character." See A History of the Art of Printing, London, 1868. By a stroke of good fortune, I was able to acquire an original leaf of the Gutenberg Bible. In 1921, a folio was issued under the title "A Noble Fragment, being a Leaf of the Gutenberg Bible, 1450 to 1455, with a biographical essay by A. Edward Newton, one of the greatest of modern bibliophiles." The volume is a slender folio and included an original page of the 42-line Bible from 1 Maccabees 10:11. Laid in is a copy of the Gutenberg Keepsake, published in 1924 by John Henry Nash. We are happy indeed to have this venerable leaf, as it is now regarded as impossible that another copy of the complete Bible will ever be placed on sale. An original leaf from the Gutenberg Bible, 1450 to 1455. The text is from 1 Maccabees 10:11. Some years ago, we secured 2 collections of leaves from famous Bibles dating from the 12th to 20th century. The material was collected and annotated by Otto F. Ege, lecturer on the history of the book, School of Library Science, Western Reserve University, Cleveland, Ohio. Each specimen was beautifully matted and included a label dating the leaf and information about the translator and publisher. The leaves had been salvaged from damaged and incomplete volumes and were of interest not only to scholars, but typographers and those concerned with the production of early printing establishments. The original leaf of an early book has greater appeal than the finest modern reproduction. When loaning biblical material in leaves to public institutions for exhibition purposes, there is no danger that a priceless volume may be damaged or stolen. Early manuscripts or printed incunabula are usually fragile, and lengthy exposures, even in cases, are not recommended. So far as Bibles are concerned, we have a fair holding in foreign translations of either the complete work, the New Testament, or separate books. The Irish New Testament stands side by side with the 4 Gospels in Turkish, the New Testament in Sanskrit, the Mongolian Gospel of Matthew, and the Chinese New Testament. The library collection includes several early and rare Bibles and 20 editions in English. It's also noticeable that a number of important editions of the Holy Scriptures were inspired by reformers who gained unusual distinction by openly condemning the teachings of the incumbent clergy. Even St. Jerome was not over-popular in his own day, and he was dead for many years before his text was fully approved. Among the best-known English versions of the Bible are the Wycliffe, Tyndale, Coverdale, and the King James. Martin Luther, 1483 to 1546. The German edition by Martin Luther caused a considerable stir, which has not entirely subsided in our day. Luther was excommunicated, but it is likely that he would have had worse treatment had he not come under the protection of the German guilds. The little room, or perhaps more correctly cell, where he labored on his translation, has long been a tourist attraction. There is a blotch on the wall which is always pointed out. It seems that while Martin Luther was engaged in his appointed task, the devil came up through the floor in an effort to divert his attention. Luther picked up his heavy inkwell and threw it at the demon, who apparently vanished. But the ink stain on the wall is plainly visible after all these centuries. A photograph of the little room where Luther labored on his translation of the Bible, showing the blotch on the wall which is always pointed out to tourists. 1895. After the celebrated trial at Worms in 1521, Luther exhibited a spiritual resolution that might have brought down upon him the displeasure of the Elector of Saxony and the maledictions of the clergy. It was considered prudent, therefore, for him to retire to the Black Forest with some of his closest followers and take up residence in the forbidding old Wartburg fortress and seek the safety of seclusion. Obviously unsuited for protracted idleness, Luther began a translation of the New Testament into German, which he finished in 3 months, basing it upon Erasmus's Greek text. This was published in 1522. While working on the Old Testament, he is quoted as saying, "I am now at work translating the prophets. Good heavens, how hard it is to make the Hebrew writers speak German." Having completed his translation, Luther invited his most learned friends to pass judgment upon the sufficiency of his endeavor. Among those he consulted was Philip Melanchthon. It was Luther's Bible that raised the German language to the level of scholarship. Title page of Luther's German translation of the Bible, printed at Wittenberg in 1541, from Humphreys' History of the Art of Printing, London, 1868. The accompanying illustration reproduces the title page of Luther's German translation of the Bible, printed at Wittenberg in 1541. The trunk of a tree divides the title page. On the viewer's right is the Christian mystery, beginning at the top with the glory of God and the heads of seraph. In the center area is the resurrection of Christ and his victory over sin and death. At the bottom, Christ is represented upon the cross, and John the Baptizer reveals the mystery of the cleansing of blood. On the left side are all the corruptions against which Luther raised his voice. The left side of the tree is withered. Deity, again represented in a cloud, is overcoming evildoers. Adam and Eve with the serpent are also featured against the pastoral background of the Edenic world. John Wycliffe, 1320 to 1384, was resolved to provide the English people with a complete translation of the Latin Vulgate. The public was well pleased, but the clergy were far from happy. Wycliffe completed the translation of the Bible in 1383 and died a natural death the following year. Thus he escaped the vengeance of the Church, which could only dig up his remains and have them publicly burned. William Tyndale, 1492 to 1536, though born in England, left that country in 1524, never to return. An edition of his New Testament was published in Worms. He was relentlessly pursued until 1535, when he was arrested and imprisoned near Brussels. His enemies were determined to dispose of him, and in 1536 he was garroted and his body burned. The labors which Tyndale was unable to finish were carried on by Miles Coverdale, and the Tyndale-Coverdale Bible was the foundation upon which the King James Version was based. This Bible was literally read to pieces, and no perfect copy of the first edition is known to exist. The Matthew's Bible, which appeared in 1537, is a respectable work, but no one has been able to decide the identity of the reviser. There seems to be a suspicion that it was the nom de plume of John Rogers. If he attempted to conceal his true identity in order to escape persecution, he failed. He is often referred to as the first Protestant martyr, and was condemned to death during the reign of Mary I and was burned at the stake of February 4th, 1555. His wife and children were denied the right to see him before his execution. The first page of the Coverdale Bible, printed in 1535. The Book of Genesis, with woodcut illustrations of the 6 days of creation. From Humphreys' History of the Art of Printing, London, 1868. A leaf from the First Heims Douai Bible, 1609 to 1610 AD. This is the first edition of the Roman Catholic Bible in English and was printed in Douai, France. Bookplate by C.W. Sherborne for the Library of the Abbey of St. Gregory the Great. The armorials feature a standing figure of St. Gregory, at the upper left, the fleur-de-lis of France, and at the right, the arms of England. During the reign of Mary, English Protestants departed the country and took refuge on the continent. When Elizabeth came to the throne, the Protestant cause was favored and the Catholics established themselves in the more favorable atmosphere of France. They almost immediately felt it necessary to issue a Catholic Bible in the English language. The New Testament was translated from the Vulgate, and the wording is strange and wonderful. A number of English words also appear unknown in other translations of the Bible, such as calinquinations, defilements, and exinanited, humbled. The book and its story by L.N.R. 1855 discusses the Douay Bible at some length. It was probably inspired in England that it was no longer possible to restrict its circulation. The Catholics therefore made their own translation. Thomas Fuller has said that it is a translation in need of being translated. Reproduced herewith is a leaf from the first Reims Douay Bible, 1609 to 1610. It was printed at Douay by Lawrence Kellam at the sign of the Holy Lamb. When this version reached England, it resulted in confusion and conflict between the Protestants and the Catholics, and is probably partly responsible for the preparation of the King James Version. In 1605, a monastery to St. Gregory the Great was established at Douay in France to escape from English influence. During the French Revolution, safety recommended that the abbey would be safer on English soil. For some time it functioned at Acton Burnell, and in 1814 it was permanently situated at Downside. The Bishop's Bible. Queen Elizabeth I, 1533 to 1603, had a mind of her own. For one cause or another, she decided that the time had come to defend the divine rights of sovereignty. She ordered Archbishop Parker to head a royal commission to prepare a version of the Holy Scriptures which would meet her approval. The result was the Bishop's Bible of 1568. The volume had a fine appearance, making use of vignettes which originally appeared in Ovid's Metamorphoses. The distinguished book collector A. Edward Newton, in his admirable work, The Greatest Book in the World, Boston, 1925, writes of the Bishop's Bible, "No thing was left undone to make this appealing. It was issued in magnificent style with a portrait of Queen Elizabeth and, in very bad taste, another of her supposed lover, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, and of Lord Burleigh, her minister." Newton also notes that about the best thing that could be said about the Bishop's Bible is that it served to pave the way for the King James Version. The 17th century was the golden age of English letters. Dedicated scholars expanded the horizons of knowledge and enriched the language. This period also brought about vast improvements in education and heralded a universal reformation of arts and sciences. In a few short years, Bacon gave the world Novum Organum and Burton The Anatomy of Melancholy. The plays attributed to Shakespeare and the King James Version of the Bible also appeared. The same era cradled the alchemists and the Rosicrucians and inspired the colonization of the Western world. Naturally, these changes met strenuous resistance. Conservative factions were locked in bitter feuds with progressives. Orthodoxy locked horns with mysticism, and there was definitely a new approach to the sacred scriptures. Jewish Kabbalists were exploring the Gematria and Notarikon, and Christian Kabbalists were searching for the secrets beneath the surface of the New Testament. In spite of all of this fervor, however, humanism was assailing the infallibility of theology. A leaf from the Bishop's Bible of 1575. Though produced under the direction of the Archbishop of Canterbury, only 19 editions seem to have been printed. Bibles were appearing in many languages in various parts of Europe, and it soon became obvious that translation of the Holy Scriptures was a delicate and dangerous procedure. Various Protestant sects had a tendency to favor the works of their own pens, and the jots and tittles became formidable barriers in both church and the home. Things gradually subsided, however, and for over 300 years the King James Version was the choice of the Protestant Christian world. The rise of a highly industrialized culture, however, began to color religious viewpoints. It was erroneously assumed that the new was superior to the old simply because it was more recent. as the attitude toward deity became increasingly critical. The simple faith of our fathers was undermined. The country church gave place to a modern architectural masterpiece, the interior of which somewhat resembled the Senate chamber in Washington, D.C. Many eccentric structures were sanctified to God, but were actually memorials to outstanding architects. Title page of the second issue of the first edition of the New Testament of the King James Bible. On the title page is the same date as the first printing from the Library of the Philosophical Research Society. The King James and other 17th century Bibles. When James VI gave up the peace and quiet of the Scottish Highlands to become James I of England, he was not entirely popular. The early years of his reign were burdened with conflicts and criticisms, and not the least of these centered on the editions of Holy Writ. Many serious Bible students, discouraged by the local confusion, ordered Bibles from the continent. Those in general circulation included the Coverdale, the Matthew, the Great Bible, the Bishops, and the Geneva. Some further complication arose as Luther's translation was widely distributed on the continent and in England. To pacify the contending factions, James convened a conference at Hampton Court in January 1604. Dr. John Reynolds of Oxford recommended that a completely new version should be prepared under the patronage of the king that would be acceptable to all the contentious congregations. The king was delighted. Almost immediately a list of 54 scholars was selected, and the king required that the government finance these men during their labors. His Majesty decreed that the new version should be modeled from the Bishop's Bible. Wherever the new translation agreed with the old, it should be accepted, and if it disagreed, the old should be given precedent. The labors of the editorial staff were simplified by the judicious use of the Geneva version and the Rheims New Testament. In 1611, the King James Version, or perhaps revision, was published in London by Robert Barker. It was in black letter and appeared as a substantial folio with an engraved title page, a preface to the reader, maps, and other appropriate embellishments. Early editions included an extensive introduction, highly controversial and sufficient to frustrate the entire work of the project had it not been gradually eliminated. Edward Newton has this to say concerning the scholars appointed by King James to prepare the edition of 1611. England was a nest of singing birds. Shakespeare was alive. He had indeed made his exit from the stage and was living in retirement in Stratford. But Bacon was at work. He had published his Advancement of Learning and was busy upon the Novum Organum. His disciples say that he had much to do with the Bible, and he may have done so, for he was the greatest scholar then living in England. See The Greatest Book in the World, Boston, 1925. The King James Bible has been called the noblest book in the English language. The presswork was actually entrusted to Miles Smith and Thomas Bilson. There are two issues of the first edition. In the earliest printing, Ruth 3:15 says, "He went into the city." As a consequence, this is generally called the He Bible. In the second issue, the line in Ruth reads, "She went into the city." As a result, this issue is known as the She Bible, the part King James played in the production of the authorized version of the Holy Scriptures will always entitle him to a measure of special appreciation. He was also very wise in opposing major changes of meanings and the neglect of literary excellence. The scriptural qualities everywhere present in the wording and certain archaic forms preserved in the text have contributed greatly to the popular respect which has been bestowed upon this Bible for nearly 4 centuries. The authorized version, as published in 1611, has become the only English translation acknowledged by the Anglican Church. Some conflict has arisen among biblical scholars insisting that advancements in Hebrew philology and biblical archaeology justify a more contemporary translation. For the most part, however, it can be pointed out with good reason that the recommended improvements are of no great significance. To disfigure the beauty and dignity of this venerated work would accomplish slight good and great harm. For advanced students of the Bible, possibly the most important item in the PRS library is the Biblia Sacra Polyglotta by Brian Walton. It is in 6 volumes imperial folio. The Old Testament is dated 1655 and the New Testament 1657. Our copy is in extremely fine condition, red-lined throughout, with an engraved portrait facing the title. Brian Walton, D.D., was born in 1600, educated at Magdalen College, Cambridge, and was chaplain to Charles I of unhappy memory. During the Commonwealth, he retired to Oxford, where he could continue his religious researches and had the leisure to work on his great polyglot Bible. After the Restoration, he was consecrated Bishop of Chester and was appointed chaplain to Charles II. We are told that Walton's Great Polyglot was the first English book ever to be sold by subscription. The price was £10 and 900 orders were received during the first 2 months. Most leaves of the Old Testament include the text in Hebrew, the Latin Vulgate, the Greek Septuagint, the Chaldean paraphrase, the Syriac and Arabic versions, each with a Latin translation. The type necessary to cover 9 languages was all made in England. Charles II, overwhelmed by the magnitude of Walton's labors, also appointed him King's Printer of Oriental Languages. The New Testament was the first of the biblical polyglots to include Persian and Ethiopic versions with Latin translations. Portrait of Edmund Castell, the author of the Great Lexicon of the Polyglot Bible, published in London, 1669. This plate is reproduced as a tribute to the memory of a great scholar. Castell's Lexicon. Edmund Castell, 1606 to 1685, was a native of Hatley in Cambridgeshire and entered the Emmanuel College, Cambridge, in 1621. He devoted the greatest part of his life to the Lexicon Heptaglotton, Hebraicum, Chaldaicum, Syriacum, Samaritanum, Ethiopiacum, Arabicum, etc., which was published in London in 2 imperial folios in 1669. It was probably intended as a companion work to Walton's Biblia Sacra Polyglotta. Castell expended more than $60,000 on his lexicon, of which only a few copies were sold. He enjoyed some preferments, but nothing to compensate him for the expense and labor over a period of 18 years. After Castell's death, his niece stored the unsold copies in a room of one of her tenants' houses, where the books lay for many years at the mercy of rats. Not enough remained usable to complete more than 1 or 2 copies. Of this tragic story, Disraeli writes, "Such were the melancholy circumstances under which the Lexicon of Castell was composed, a work which has long challenged the admiration and defied the competition of foreigners, and which, with the great polyglot of Walton, its inseparable and invaluable companion, has raised an eternal monument of literary fame." See Dibdin's Greek and Latin classics. We are fortunate in also having Castell's Lexicon. A leaf from an Eliot Indian Bible printed in 1685. This is the second and revised edition in the language of the Algonquin tribe. This language is now extinct. Eliot Indian Bible. The first translation of the Bible into the language of a pagan people was accomplished by John Eliot, 1604 to 1690, a minister of Roxbury, Massachusetts. It was the first scripture printed in North America. Eliot has often been called the Apostle of the North American Indians. He was born in Essex, England, and emigrated to Boston in 1631. With a great effort, he acquired the Algonquin language and dedicated most of his life to spreading the gospel among the members of this tribe. The Algonquins had no written language, and Eliot was required first to acquire their oral tongue, second to transform their vocabulary into equivalent sounds in English, and third to teach the Indians to recognize their own language in the English word combinations. The first edition appeared in 1663 under the title Mamuse Wune Tupamatamwe Ubiblum Godna Niswe Nukone Testament Ka Wonkwusku Testament. The longest word used in the Bible is in St. Mark 1:40, Utapesitu Kusunokwetunkwo, kneeling down to him. Eliot received financial help from England and inspired the establishment of the Company for Propagating the Gospel in New England and parts adjacent in 1649. The Eliot Indian Bible was reissued in 1685, and a leaf from this edition is reproduced herewith. Sequoyah, a half-breed Cherokee Indian, was born about 1770 of an Indian mother and a Caucasian father. Although he did not know a single word of English, he invented an alphabet consisting of 86 characters by which all words of the Cherokee language could be recorded in written form. The labor required 12 years, and Sequoyah had considerable difficulty in convincing his people that this system was not a form of black magic. Christian missionaries published considerable literature in the Cherokee language, and about 18 years after Sequoyah's death, the entire New Testament was published in the Cherokee language. Sequoyah had the dream of creating an Indian language that would unite all the tribes of North America, but he died before his dream could be fulfilled. In 1813, the four Gospels were translated into the language of the Eskimo Indians on the coast of Labrador by missionaries of the Unitas Fratrum, or United Brethren. The Jefferson Bible. In the year 1803, Thomas Jefferson cut from the pages of the New Testament such verses as presented the ethical teachings of Jesus concisely and in what he considered to be the proper sequence. The labor was not for his own use alone, but for the benefit of Indian tribes unable to understand the numerous complications of the Scriptures. The original work was labeled Morals of Jesus, but is now in publication with the title The Jefferson Bible. It sets forth in simple and direct form the essence and substance of the Christian life way. It is evident that Thomas Jefferson had the deepest respect for the teachings of Jesus Christ. It is meaningful that as the third President of the United States, the author of the Declaration of Independence, and the founder of the University of Virginia, he was a man of strong religious convictions. He writes, "Say nothing of my religion. It is known to my God and myself alone. Its evidence before the world is to be sought in my life. If that has been honest and dutiful to society, the religion which has regulated it cannot be a bad one." Modern Bibles and Bible societies. In 1804, the British and Foreign Bible Society was established in England. The principal objective was to make translation of the Holy Bible or sections thereof available to persons of all nations and denominations at an extremely low price. In the library of the Philosophical Research Society, we have a number of translations issued by or through the activities of this British organization. We note, for example, the four Gospels in Ethiopian, printed at the request and expense of the British and Foreign Bible Society in 1826. The same organization distributed in 1860 the New Testament in Hindustani and published the New Testament of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ in the Zulu language in 1890. The Gospel of St. Matthew in Classical Mongolian, published by British and Foreign Bible Society, Shanghai, 1900. The bookplate of the Society for Propagating the Gospel in Foreign Parts. It is dated 1704 and shows a missionary on the deck of a sailing vessel with American Indians assembling on the shore, awaiting conversion. From American Bookplates by Charles Dexter Allen, New York, 1894. A major undertaking was the complete Bible in the Urdu language in Roman script, which the same society distributed in 1898. One of the most intriguing of the numerous labors for the propagation of the faith is the Gospel of St. Matthew in Classical Mongolian. This was printed under the auspices of the British and Foreign Bible Society in Shanghai in 1900. It is noted that printings in modern type are seldom found in Mongolian collections. We reproduce the title page of this item. In 1899, 3 traveling men organized the Gideons International for the purpose of distributing Bibles in hotels, hospitals, and other institutions and schools. During World War II, this organization distributed New Testaments to members of the armed services. When I was in Japan a few years ago, I found the usual Gideon's Bible in my hotel room. Side by side with it is a smaller book, The Teachings of Buddha, placed there by the Bukkyo Dendo Kyokai Buddhism, Promoting Foundation. The publishers of this work give credit to the unsparing efforts of Mr. Dwight Goddard, an American who was converted to Buddhism and was the author of a Buddhist Bible. According to Guinness Book of World Records 1983, between the years 1815 and 1975, some 2,500 million Bibles were printed either completely or in parts in 1,735 languages. These figures do not include 16th, 17th, and 18th century printings, of which there were large and numerous editions. It may reasonably be assumed, therefore, that nearly every literate living person has had some direct contact with the sacred writings of Christianity. Let us consider for a moment the New English Bible New Testament, Oxford University Press and Cambridge University Press, 1961. We will call attention to a few of the changes of the new translators. In the King James Version, Matthew 1:1 and 2 read as follows. Now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and are come to worship him. The New Version reads, Jesus was born at Bethlehem in Judea during the reign of Herod. After his birth, astrologers from the east arrived in Jerusalem, asking, Where is the child who is born to be King of the Jews? We observed the rising of his star and have come to pay him homage. While there are no world-shaking changes, it appears unusual that modern scholarship should condone the introduction of astrologers into this text. In most translations, the wise men who came to worship Jesus, including those in the King James Version and the Vulgate, together with Chaldean, Arabic, Persian and Ethiopian scriptures, definitely were called Magi. It is also noticeable that in the New Version, the star in the east has entirely disappeared. They have translated Orient as rising instead of the east. Of course, in the older languages, the word Orient represents east, but there is an adjective form of the word in Latin which means to rise. We may therefore properly say, but never do, that the Orient sun means the rising sun. In the 5th chapter, 3rd verse of Matthew, the King James Version reads, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The New Version appears to be a complete failure. How blessed are those who know that they are poor, the kingdom of heaven is theirs. In the same chapter, 9th verse, Jesus is made to say, Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. The recently improved text states it a little differently. How blessed are the peacemakers, God shall call them his sons. Apparently the improvement intimates that the peacemakers are all male, whereas children meets the objections likely to arise among the members of the women's liberation movement. Nearly all of the Beatitudes have been subjected to major or minor changes. Matthew 5:25 and 26 have been given a considerable working over. The King James Bible says, Agree with thine adversary quickly, whilst thou art in the way with him, lest at any time the adversary deliver thee to the judge, and the judge deliver thee to the officer, and thou be cast into prison. Verily I say unto thee, thou shalt by no means come out thence, till thou hast paid the uttermost farthing. The new reading is as follows. If someone sues you, come to terms with him promptly while you are both on your way to court. Otherwise he may hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the constable, and you will be put in jail. I tell you, once you are there, you will not be let out till you have paid the last farthing. This seems to suggest that some unfortunate person is likely to be locked up in Old Bailey. It seems extremely unlikely that Jesus, speaking nearly 2,000 years ago, should use such words. Here, however, the revising committee might have made a useful change, for it is certain that Jesus did not use the word farthing. It is strictly British and could not have been taken from the Greek, but is a good old Anglo-Saxon word for a small coin, which is a quarter of a British pence, equivalent to a half-cent in American money. This coin is of no value anywhere, including the British Isles. In 1937, an attempt was made to modernize the King James Version of the Bible so that it could be read as living literature. It is stated in this work that spelling and punctuation are modernized, genealogies and repetitions are omitted, as well as the whole of Chronicles, the minor epistles, and similar unimportant passages throughout. The drastic determination to break away from the classical versions seems to serve no useful purpose. The Bible has had the largest circulation of any book in the world. It has the further advantage of a wonderful translation into the English language with a vast reading public and a second language in many foreign countries. The two testaments are indispensable to each other, for if there were no book of Genesis, there could be no justification for the revelation of St. John. Religious art became very progressive until the subjects were difficult to distinguish. Old hymns were not heard so much anymore, and innovations in this area are not exactly paeans of praise from the grateful heart. With integrity edited out of history, morality eliminated from biography, and honesty regarded as an economic detriment, it is inevitable that sooner or later a revision of the Holy Scriptures would be considered as necessary, or at least appropriate. The devout scholars who labored together to create the harmony of Scripture that we find in the King James Version have departed from this troubled sphere, and successors with appropriate insights have not arisen to take their places. As a result, the several new versions of the Bible that are now regarded as major improvements on the older texts are something less than satisfactory. That there are good scholars, no one will deny, but they live in a century that has given us little but wars, depressions, revolutions, and economic insecurity. It is increasingly difficult to find outstanding examples of hope, faith, and charity. Some have assumed that more people will read the Bible if many of the pious wordings were restated in commonplace terms. Recent revisions of the Bible contribute little or nothing to the improvement of the text. The principal objective is to cater to readers who are accustomed to popular contemporary literature. It is assumed by some that the authorized version is too exalted for those accustomed to select their reading from book clubs. A religion-oriented person would rather hope that the sublimity of the King James Bible might lift the consciousness of those seeking spiritual comfort and consolation. Some of the revised texts would indicate that the tone of the Bible should be lowered to the comprehension of casual scanners. Before we edit the Bible according to personal prejudices or the fashions of the time, there is a far more important consideration: who wrote this sacred book? A number of the books of the Old and New Testaments are attributed to sanctified persons who lived long ago. The early sections of the Old Testament perpetuate the oral traditions of more remote times. The names associated with the New Testament are not found in the earliest manuscripts, and even assuming them to be correct, the mystery of authorship is not actually solved. For many believers, the Bible was delivered to humanity by prophets, inspired by God. At the moment, we have no better explanation. As new translations or revisions of the Bible are based upon previous, more or less acceptable renditions of the text, it is remarkable that the sacred scriptures should be an endless cause of controversy and persecution. Religion and politics were locked in bitter feuding, and most Bibles read in English homes were printed on the continent. When these precious volumes were smuggled into the homes of the pious, the owners were subject to imprisonment and heavy fines. In substance, the translations differed but little, and the changes were due to the dispositional preference of the editors. Although Protestant versions were rejected by the Catholic clergy, the translation itself was not criticized. The offense was that it did not carry the authorization of the Church. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.